Hello, everyone. Welcome. This podcast is called The Person You Want to Be, and I am your host, Eric Teplitz. Today, it is my great honor and privilege to have with me someone whose work I have admired for many years, Eric Maisel. Eric Maisel is a retired family therapist, active creativity coach, and the author of over 50 books. That's 50, over 50 books. He is widely regarded as America's foremost creativity coach and has written extensively on the challenges of the creative life in books such as Fearless Creating, Coaching the Artist Within, Creative Recovery, The Gogh Blues, Mastering Creative Anxiety, and The Power of Daily Practice. His books for writers specifically include Deep Writing, Right Mind, Living the Writer's Life, A Writer's Space, A Writer's Paris, and A Writer's San Francisco. He also has written books that deal specifically with life purpose and meaning issues, including Life Purpose Bootcamp and a book called Lighting the Way, which is a primer on a comprehensive philosophy of life he himself has developed called Keyrism. In addition to all of this, Dr. Maisel writes extensively in the area known as critical psychiatry, where he is a thought leader and advocate for significant shifts in mental health paradigms and practices. His books in this realm include Rethinking Depression, The Future of Mental Health, and Humane Helping. He is also lead editor on the Ethics International Press Critical Psychology and Critical Psychiatry series. And this year, 2022, the first two volumes in that series, Critiquing the Psychiatric Model and Humane Alternatives to the Psychiatric Model, will appear. Dr. Maisel writes the Rethinking Mental Health blog for Psychology Today with over 3 million views, 3 weekly blogs for the Good Men Project, and he also blogs regularly for Thrive Global and Fine Art America. He presents workshops, webinars, and keynotes, including a deep writing workshop that he has presented in locations such as London, Paris, New York, San Francisco, Dublin, Rome, and Prague, and at workshop and retreat centers like Esalen, the Omega Institute, Kripalu, Hollyhock, and the Art of Living Retreat Center. Dr. Maisel is based in the San Francisco Bay Area, where he trains creativity coaches and maintains a worldwide creativity coaching practice. Eric Maisel, welcome to The Person You Want to Be.
Hi, Eric. That exhausted me. I think I'm going to take a nap. But thank you.
Yeah, that's the end of our show, folks. Thanks very much for listening.
Okay.
My first question, and that was a very truncated version. I should let people know of your bio. So my first question is just, when do you sleep?
I sleep a lot. I'm asked that question a lot, and my response is I sleep a lot. My day starts at about 5 a.m. I go directly to work at 5 a.m. I work an 8 or 9 or 10-hour day. At 3 p.m. I quit. My wife and I have our happy hour, watch a movie or two, and I'm in bed by 7 or 8. So I get about 9 hours sleep, which I need. As a non-youngster, I need sleep. But if you work an 8 or 9 or 10-hour day, 7 days a week, you get a lot done.
Yeah, and sleep is so important. I mean, I just know that I would love to get that much sleep. I don't always feel like I have a choice because sleep issues have been a chronic problem. But I guess it's comforting.
Let me sell you on something. Let me sell you on something.
Go for it.
I have a book called Sleep Thinking, which is about how we use our brain while we sleep, or rather what our brain does while we sleep. And it's interesting that if we enlist our brain to do some real work while we sleep, by giving ourselves a sleep thinking prompt before we go to bed, like, I wonder what Mary wants to say to John in chapter 3 of my novel, our brain will run with that. Mary and John will have a conversation, and when you wake up, you can take dictation and your novel will progress. But by enlisting your brain that way, we actually sleep better because we're going to bed with a wonder rather than a worry.
Hmm.
Most people are very agitated as they go to sleep nowadays for good reason. But if you're a creative person and you can get inside your creative work as you go to bed and give yourself a sleep thinking prompt that invites your brain to wonder, you'll actually sleep better.
Wow. So in my case, I usually have no problem falling asleep. I go right out. It's waking up in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And then when that becomes a recurring thing, the mind just goes to all the anxious places and it becomes sort of a vicious cycle. Would you have
That's one
anything to
version of
say?
insomnia, right? Most people think insomnia is not being able to get to sleep, but actually another version is the one you just described, which is waking up and not being able to get back to sleep. What's good there is to have a story that you know to tell yourself, a replacement story for whatever is worrying you at that split second. Some calming story. It could be a revenge fantasy. It could be anything under the sun. But just something that you know to tell yourself that relaxes you. That helps.
Hmm. I will certainly give that a try. I will brainstorm some scenarios after we speak. So I'm wondering if we can go back. I'm just like you. I'm very fascinated by human personality. You have a really provocative and fascinating way of thinking and speaking about human personality. You describe three aspects of it: original personality, formed personality, and available personality. I kind of think personally of the first two as more deterministic kind of things that shape our personality, and the final one as our free will to whatever extent we have that.
I think that's a fair way to describe it. Both original personality and formed personality are not particularly in our control. It's our available personality that allows us to live a life somewhat in control. The first idea, original personality, has to do with how we come into the world. And anybody who's had kids or kittens or puppies knows that every creature comes into the world already itself. Psychology is not interested in this, takes no position on original personality, never thinks about it, leaves it to occult ideas like astrology or what have you. And by not thinking about original personality, it gives itself a way to make something like inborn sadness the mental disorder of depression. It allows for mental disorders to accumulate by virtue of not taking original personality into account. If we come into the world already something, a little more sensitive than the next person, a little more intelligent than the next person, a little sadder than the next person, that's not a mental disorder. That's a lifelong challenge. It's something we have to consider, but it's not a mental disorder. So there's original personality. Then, as you say, there's formed personality, which is the way we stiffen over time into our recognizable self, into our repetitive self. And I like the idea of that phrase because I think it gives us a sense of how stiff we get, how difficult it is to change that formed idea, like sort of cement stiffening. But fortunately, we do have available personality available to us. And I see it as a kind of a mount that changes according to circumstances, according to the work we do on ourselves. I think a good analogy is somebody who's an active addict running around town looking for a fix does not have that much available personality available. He's looking for a fix most of the day. The second he enters recovery, something happens. He gets more of his personality back. He has more personality available. It's still fragile. It's still an amount that can shift back in the wrong direction. But there's a huge change from one day to the next when somebody enters recovery. For me, that's one of the good signs about our species is that folks can enter into recovery, that's a possibility, that we know that millions of people do that. Yes, they trip, yes, they slip, yes, they fall, but the fact that they can do that is a little bit of a blessing for the species.
You've also, in your work, mentioned that it's really difficult to pinpoint where original personality stops and formed personality kind of takes over, right? But I'm wondering, when you think back on yourself as a kid, whether it be your original personality, your formed personality, or some combination thereof, did you have any fanciful dreams or early ideas of what it was you wanted to do or become or achieve?
The short answer is yes. I followed a path that didn't connect to what I'm about to say. I followed a math and science path because I was good at math and science, and that seemed a sensible path. So in my early years, I thought I'd be a astrophysicist type. That's who I thought I would be. I went to a special math and science high school in Manhattan called Stuyvesant. So I lived that path, but what I thought I really was a resistance fighter. I was born right after World War II. That language, that imagery of resistance fighting went someplace deep into me. And that's how I envisioned living. And I saw already at the age of 4, 5, 6, 7, what I took to be a lot of humbug around me. I didn't believe in religion right off the bat. I didn't understand why my friends were forced to go to either yeshiva or Catholic school. My neighborhood was mostly Jewish and Italian. Didn't understand it. Didn't think that there could be a God who cared if you put a hat on top of your head when you were in his presence, or cared if you put dairy on this plate and meat on that plate. It seemed ridiculous to me that somebody should invent these kinds of creatures, these kinds of fantasy creatures who cared about such things. So I saw it very early on that I was to have a mission resisting humbug, but I didn't know what that meant at that age. But I felt it. I felt that there was an awful lot of nonsense going on around me, and that there was a lot of life was ridiculous. Early on, probably before I was 10, I was reading the existentialists, primarily Sartre and Camus, but way back to Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and all the usual suspects.
How does a 10-year-old encounter those books? I'm wondering.
I don't know. I don't know. I was also reading Newton because I was a science boy, so I was reading Principia Mathematica at 7 or 8 or 9. I was on both tracks. In fact, I can still picture the Dover edition of Principia Mathematica. At any rate, those were the things I was reading. Just as an aside, Sartre's autobiography, which is called Les Mots, The Words, it's a brief autobiography, but he said one thing in there that really struck me, and it struck me my whole life. I grew up with my mom. There was no father around. I didn't need one. I didn't want one. I thought my friends were burdened by their dads who would come home from work and be mean. And so in Les Mots, Sartre writes that he was glad not to have a father, quote, laying full length on him, unquote. So I think one of the ways I've had permission to be myself is never having a father laying full length on me. That's just an aside, but I was reading the existentialists early on. I found them to be very interesting. And then I encountered one of the seminal essays by Sartre where he says, here's the agenda for existentialism. Here's where existentialism should go next. And it never went there. So even as a young kid, I had this fanciful notion that I was going to update and upgrade existentialism at some point. And I think that's what I've been doing in one way or another in these various books, is to upgrade and update existential thought.
Where did Sartre leave off, or where did he say it needed to go next?
I can't remember the precise language, but it had to do with not really making any clear statements about meaning as a psychological experience, as opposed to something that's lost and needs to be found. He did not make, already I understood that there ought to be a difference in thinking between the idea of life purpose and life purposes. But basically, he didn't spell out how personal responsibility was supposed to work in the real world. What good faith was to mean in the real world, what authenticity was supposed to mean in the real world. And he then instantly engaged in an act of big bad faith by starting to write a biography of a French writer. Forget if it was Flaubert or Balzac, one or the other. This multi-thousand page huge thing which he thought was going to help workers somehow. A biography of Flaubert or Balzac was going to help workers. Made no sense. I knew it was an act of bad faith somehow. Even as a kid, I knew that he dropped the ball. So I can't say precisely what he identified. I don't remember precisely what he identified as what ought to come next. But back then I knew that something ought to come next, and it wasn't coming. And by the way, the postmodern deconstructionists, the French postmodernists, were very interesting to me, but they didn't take existentialism the next step. To say it one way, they were good at deconstructing but not reconstructing. There was no reconstructive postmodernism. I've been interested in language philosophy, again, since I was a kid. Language philosophy goes back essentially to the British philosophers of the turn of the 19th century, Bertrand Russell, whole slew of Wittgenstein, whole slew of them. Made most popular by Orwell, really. Orwell is the author who looks at language in a way that got communicated to all of us. Peace is war, war is peace. Everyone is equal because some are equal than others. All of that stuff that Orwell shared with us in his books really interested me. And so when the postmodernists continued that investigation of language and how language operates, including Chomsky, there was a lot of interesting writing. It just didn't speak to reconstructive existentialism for me. It was all very interesting. Language analysis is still very important to me. How the mental disorder paradigm works is by language. It works as an analogy to physical disorder. It's brilliant. Just saying the word mental disorder makes you think they exist when they don't. So one of my tools has been language analysis, and just rambling a bit here, but this is just by way of saying those threads, language analysis, postmodernism, existentialism, they were all very important to me already as a young kid, even though I thought I was doing science.
Wow. Did you have anyone to talk to at this age about these ideas, whether it was either an adult figure in your life or perhaps even some peers? Because this seems a pretty unusual thing for a very young person to be, immersed in.
No, I was completely on my own journey. So it's so much so that I couldn't do homework for school. I found that just implausibly boring. So I had a friend, Lou. We were subway kids. We were traveling from deep in Brooklyn to Manhattan for high school. Every morning he'd get on the subway first. He was a little further out in Brooklyn. I'd get on the subway. We'd meet on the train, and I'd copy his homework because I could not do my own homework. It was just too boring to me.
You couldn't be bothered.
I could not be bothered, which is why I did not end up with a stellar high school GPA, and why I went to Brooklyn College as opposed to Harvard.
That's interesting.
But at any
It reminds me of that scene from Annie Hall where the young version of Woody Allen, his mother takes him to, I don't know if it's a psychiatrist, and says, he's not doing his homework. And the kid's like, what's the point? The universe is expanding.
And dying. It's probably the universe dying and expanding and dying. Yes, no. I could talk to my mother about interesting things, like she would present me with the problems that her friends were having, and I would solve those problems at 5 or 6. I'd be a
Oh my God. What would be an example?
She had a couple where they were fighting. He wanted the window open at night and she wanted the window closed. And with the window open, bugs came in. So I said, get a screen.
There you go.
That was the level of problem solving it. Why don't they get a screen? Then they can have the window open and the bugs won't come in.
Maybe that was your first coaching session.
That's exactly right. Or just being, let's say, rational. in praise of rationality.
Yeah. That's hard for humans to do, really, even the most determined of us. I mean, that's one of the big challenges, I think, of this gig, this human being gig.
Yeah.
So did you have something to add? You were going to add to that?
No.
So how did you said that you didn't do well in school.
Okay. I mean, I was an 85% kind of student. Now on the exam, on the, whatever they were called, the SATs or what have you, those I did well, because mostly if they were not content driven, if it was about thinking, I could do well. I had to know something. I didn't know things. I didn't know the formula. I still actually did okay. But I I didn't maximize my potential in high school,
Like so many of us.
like so many of us.
Um,
But by the
Tell me
way,
about, yeah,
I
yeah.
want to say, so the WPA, sounds like a real non sequitur. How do you get to the WPA? But Roosevelt's WPA project in the 1930s and 1940s to resuscitate the country during the Depression produced all kinds of interesting studies. Roosevelt spent all kinds of money on not just building roads, but on projects, sociological and psychological projects, one of which was to study the differences between intelligent students and creative students. We've never done this since. We've never been smart enough to do these kinds of studies since. But in the 1940s, these studies were done, very interesting studies. And teachers were asked to identify which of your students do you think are creative and which do you think are sort of merely intelligent. And so the teachers actually had no trouble distinguishing one from another. And then the kids were put in the two groups and asked questions. And what are we going to get from this? The intelligent kids wanted to know what was on the exam. Creative kids didn't care about the exam. Intelligent kids wanted to know what was a path to making money. Creative kids didn't care about money. In many markers, the creative kids were 2 standard deviations away from where the intelligent kids were with respect to normalcy or complacency or everydayness. So it's actually very interesting that those kids who may do the best, put their nose to the grindstone and what have you, do the best in high school, may not be the most creative folks around. They may be very intelligent, may be able to win every spelling bee or ace every math test, and never quite go to that place, go to that creative place that allows them to do that thing that's called connecting remote associates, making new things, taking a salmon over here and a skyscraper over there and making a salmon-shaped skyscraper, which is a tongue twister, apparently.
You know, it's funny that they distinguish creativity from intelligence, because as far as I'm concerned, creativity is a form of intelligence.
Maybe, but I think it's something different from that. I think it's about getting quiet in a certain way, going deep in a certain way, and bringing something back from somewhere. And I'm not sure that's about intelligence. That's more about being an adventurer of a certain sort,
Wow.
or going on a journey of a certain sort, rather than brain cells, number of neuronal connections. I don't think it's about neuronal connections. I think it's about
Really?
something else. Yeah.
Huh. That's interesting, because I've always felt that there were, you know, that we have this sort of hierarchy of intelligences that's very condescending and very, insulting to a lot of people. For instance, there are people who have a brilliant mechanical sense. They can take something apart, put it back together again. Yeah. I look at that, and to me, that's brilliance. Like I'm helpless in a situation like that. I feel like that's a type of intelligence that I either did not naturally possess, and or it was never nurtured in me. I never had a reason to, develop it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and creativity, and creativity also to me seems, I don't know, because there's this, long-standing question of, can creativity be taught? What do you think about that?
During the WPA time, other interesting studies were done, and one of them were some very smart enrichment studies. This isn't about creativity being taught exactly, but connects to what you're describing. And the question that the research asked was, if we take 2 groups of young kids and enrich one group in certain ways by giving them certain kinds of materials and resources, will their IQ tests improve? This is the time of IQ tests, way back when IQ tests were considered reliable and valid. And the short answer is, yep, 15 IQ points on average were added. That's a lot. That's more than a full standard deviation, because most IQ tests have about 10 IQ points as a standard deviation. So this is a 1.5 standard deviation increase in intelligence, or rather, whatever intelligent tests measure,
Right.
by virtue of enrichment. So can creativity be taught? Can intelligence be increased? I think the short answer is yes. I think we tend to do stupid jobs of it. But if we did smart jobs of it, I think we could. For one thing, we simply don't ask kids interesting questions. If you were to ask a kid, how do you think you'd go about getting world peace? They would enjoy themselves. Who knows where they would go in their thinking? But they're never asked a question like that.
To me, that almost suggests kids are naturally creative, right? Would you say?
If you want to use the word that way, they're naturally deep thinkers. They're naturally curious. Maybe that's the word I would use. I'm not sure about creative, because even though lots of kids would tackle that question, only some of them would come up with creative responses to it. So I think all would be curious and give it a go, so to speak, but not all would be as creative in responding to the question.
And you used the term enrichment as potentially affecting a child's, creative abilities.
Yep.
And what would qualify as enrichment in your estimation?
Well, lots of different kinds of responses. One is kids have permission to make creative mistakes and messes till they're about 3.5, so to speak. After that, they're supposed to draw inside the lines, know the answers for tests, etc. Do well on the piano recital, all that stuff. One of the central keys to enrichment, or to creativity, or to producing interesting stuff is having lifelong permission to make mistakes and messes. Few people have that. Most of my clients have to be reminded again and again and again that the creative process demands a respect for mistakes and messes, and that they have to move in an everyday way from their ordinary mind, which demands that they get things right, appropriately enough. You want to drive on the correct side of the road. You want to remember to put your kids at 3. You want to get things right, but there has to come a time where you don't have to get things right. And for most people, they don't know to make that. They don't know how to make that transition. They don't know to make that transition. And even if they know to make it, they don't know how to make that transition to a mindset where they're allowed to spend 2 years on a novel that doesn't work. Most people do not have that permission to spend 2 years on a novel that doesn't work and then follow it up with another novel that doesn't work. Maybe it's their third novel that's good. Few people want to hear this or can tolerate it. Few people can tolerate writing 2 bad novels in search of their third good novel. So this wasn't exactly about enrichment, but these are the sorts of things that matter when it comes to a person's ability to create and to create a body of work.
What do you think then allows some people to have that permission, as you put it, versus the majority of us who don't?
I think some people come out of the womb stubborn.
Interesting.
Stubbornly, it's like you just know that if all the different fields, whatever the field is, you just know that a Steve Jobs or this person or that person, they make a mistake, they just go, made a mistake. On we go. You just know that they're snapping their fingers and go. I mean, they may have some emotional reaction. They may have a bad month. Something, there may be some downside to making a huge mistake, but then they get back on the horse.
This is so fascinating to me because I have a friend who I'm thinking of in particular, who his resilience in dealing with rejection, criticism, nothing stops him from creating. He's just driven to do it. And it doesn't matter what kind of external success or validation. Of course, he wants that. He seeks that. But regardless of that, he doesn't ever, to my mind, he might argue, he might disagree. He doesn't get derailed the way I know from speaking from personal experience. I've gotten seriously derailed from putting forth incredible amounts of effort and investing so much of myself in something and being profoundly disappointed with the results.
That's right.
Um, yeah, and some of that clearly comes from our environment because, we live in a society and a culture that demands, that you be correct, that you do things properly, correctly, and that punishes mistakes and messes. So that's why I was wondering as to what
I do
what
think
allows some people.
I do think it is both nature and nurture, but I think
Hmm.
there is a nature component. I do think that there is some stubbornness inbred in some people. I see it in little kids. It's not oppositional defiance disorder. It's not that nonsense. It's them
Hmm.
having strong opinions about things.
Hmm.
And you can just feel that they're on their own journey of individuality. And I know that you were enjoying my book, Lighting the Way, in which I write about absurd rebellion. You just know that they're going to be engaged in absurd rebellion. They're going to do things that make no sense to the outside world. They're going to choose professions that don't make them money. They're going to wallpaper their wall with rejection slips. They're just going to keep going on. And I do think it's an original personality feature. Now you probably
Hmm.
need some good nurturing along these lines too, where you have more permission than the next person to make mistakes and messes, and you have that permission longer, and you're probably told by one parent or another, you're great, you're wonderful, do what you like in life, go forward, don't listen to people, everybody
Hmm.
has an opinion, don't listen to other people, etc. They're probably getting those kinds of messages, but those are pretty rare messages in households. The usual message in a household is be quiet, we're eating, get good grades, choose a profession that makes sense, etc. And by the way, where the rubber hits the road for creative teenagers or for creative kids is typically in junior year in high school, where their parents may have been paying lip service to their creative efforts all along. Wow, what a nice drawing you brought home. And now, when the teenager says, I want to go to art school, the parents just in horror throw up their hands and say, what are you talking about? You must become an engineer. And so those years, 17, 18, 19, junior year, senior year of high school, and first year of college are very difficult years for members of our species who are creative.
I'm nodding in agreement. Um, hmm. I think now for kids coming of age now, honestly, it's even harder. I think the stakes are so high because of the cost of education, which is so prohibitive in general, that you don't have the luxury of using college as an exploratory kind of pursuit. But the pressure to have something that's going to produce income to make your ROI on the investment of the absurd investment of what a college education costs nowadays.
Yeah.
So,
Let me just
wow.
piggyback on that just a tiny bit. I have a
Mhm.
book coming out, I think in August, called Why Smart Teens Hurt. And it's a kind of follow up book to a book I did called Why Smart People Hurt. But of course, it looks at teens specifically. And I've really enjoyed doing that book because um, my son, who lives in Brazil, grew up in Europe with his mom in the Netherlands, met a Russian woman, lived in Siberia, had a daughter. They divorced. He went to Brazil, married a Brazilian woman. They have a daughter. But what this means is I have a Siberian granddaughter, Katya, who just is 18, and she collaborated on this book with me.
Wow.
And that was just she speaks like these people do, unlike Americans. She speaks Italian,
Hmm.
French, English, Russian, and she's learning Hebrew. But she can make smart sentences using deconstruct in English. You try doing that in Russian. So it was just a wonderful experience to
Wow.
have to collaborate with her on this book.
Have you ever actually met her face to face?
No, it's all Zoom and
Yeah.
email. We will now. She just graduated from Russian high school and she's going to Italian university. So we'll meet in Europe somewhere, probably this coming year.
Incredible. Incredible. And from what age do you think she was speaking English among her many languages?
Well, I'm sure. I mean, her dad, my son, her dad was around sufficient enough that maybe from an early age she was speaking English. I'm actually not sure about that. I don't know one way or another. I know that her language of choice, other than Russian, has been Italian. She's just infatuated with Italy.
Hmm. Wow, that's an incredible story. And again, this is like an example of how technology it can be such a blessing to be able to connect us, especially right in the last couple of years. My goodness. Anyway, I want to backtrack a little bit to your story. So you mentioned that you went to Brooklyn College instead of Harvard, and tell me about your experience at Brooklyn College. How long did it even last?
Way longer than it should have. It lasted a year and a half. I attended virtually no classes. I discovered girls. I liked to play ping pong. Oh, and I started college at 16, which was a little young.
Well, now that explains how you've gotten to write 50 books.
There you go. So I attended no classes. This will strike some of you as funny. I loved to march. I joined the Air Force ROTC. I was like Soldier of the Month. I liked the rhythmicity of marching. So the only class I think I ever got an A on at Brooklyn College was ROTC.
Wow.
And as I say, I didn't go to school much, but it took them a year and a half to flunk me out. They weren't watching me carefully. So I was under their radar for a little while. So then, just at about 18, or give or take, I was out of college. This is Vietnam era. This is 65. Yeah. So I knew I would be drafted, or presumed I'd be drafted. So I enlisted. That's the next thing I did in life, was to enlist in 1965 in the Army. And so I was in the Army from 1965 to 1968, stationed mostly in Korea. I was a platoon sergeant in Korea, if that makes any sense cosmically, but that's what I did. When I came back from Korea, I was a drill sergeant at Fort Dix, if that makes any sense cosmically, but that's what I did. And then when I got out of the Army at 21, I went to the University of Oregon. This is a Casablanca story. If folks who remember the movie Casablanca will remember, Rick is asked how he ended up in Casablanca, and he thought it was by the water, and I was misinformed. I thought I had seen a brochure for Oregon State University and its oceanography department while I was in the Army, and I figured if you have an oceanography department, you must be on the water, right? So I went to Oregon State University, discovered it wasn't on the water, and it was too conservative for me. So after a summer, I moved to the University of Oregon, and that's where I got my first degree in. What do you get a degree in when you have no idea what you're doing? Philosophy. So my first degree was in philosophy.
You probably had already read all of the material by then.
Well, no, because you have to do things like medieval philosophy, and I can tell you that I did not read much of Occam's Razor or
You had your limits as a kid, right? That's where you drew the line.
That's certainly related to religious philosophy, of which we had to do. Well, a lot of I did not read classical philosophy as a kid. I didn't read Kant and Descartes and what have you, and so I had to stomach that stuff to get the degree. But the classes in post-1945 European literature or contemporary existentialism, those were my classes.
Yeah. A couple of things. So I wanted to backtrack a second. How did you tolerate being in the Army for those years, being this kind of personality that you were and are? Was it difficult, or how did you view it?
Well, because I think it's completely the difference between being in Vietnam and not being in Vietnam. Not being in Vietnam, most of the orders were not onerous. It did not strike me as problematic if we had a mission to go to a certain bunker and sit there and make believe that the North Koreans might be coming. I really had no problem. I understood the mission. Our mission was really the following mission: to stop the whole North Korean army for 15 or 20 seconds while the folks behind us prepared to really stop the North Korean army. We were just fodder. It was just a suicide mission. But I understood it. I bought this. But had I been in Vietnam being told by a company commander, go take that piece of jungle, I'm not sure I could have tolerated that, because that would have seemed just super ridiculous. Because I would have known, well, then they take the jungle, then we take the jungle, then they... That would have struck me. I was just talking with my 8-year-old grandson, Ethan, who's into World War II, about the Battle of Stalingrad, where 2 million soldiers faced each other for 6 months, million on each side, going 3 inches this way, 3 inches that way, 3 inches this way, 3 inches that way. Hundreds of thousands of casualties. So there's a difference between a peacetime activity and a wartime activity. That's kind of a mixed bag answer, but I could tolerate it because most of the orders were tolerable.
All right. So you end up in Oregon, viewing the lovely ocean, and you have you managed to, see through a college degree this time.
Barely.
Barely.
Barely. My nemesis was had to take. Now, remember, this is post-science now. I was not interested in science, but you had to take a solid, I guess they'd call a solid science to graduate. Mm-hmm. I kept taking geology and failing it because I could not show up for the classes or take the tests. So I was one geology class short of graduating. This is a long, complicated story, but I'll give you the short answer, which was because my geology professor wanted to get to Alaska and do some adventuring, he finally gave me I pestered him to a D.
Wow.
He allowed me to graduate. But it was by the skin of my nose because I just could not make myself do that glacier nonsense.
How interesting. All right. So now on your website, you have a bio that kind of gives sort of highlights of your life story. And at this point, it says that you subsequently lived in Boston, New York, and San Francisco, and traveled extensively in Europe, spending time in London, Dublin, and Budapest. So, what's with all the bouncing around? What was the impetus behind all of those moves?
Well, I was in Oregon for 3-ish years till I was 24 or so. During that time, I got married. We had our son, David. I had friends who ended up in Boston, essentially in what now we'd call a startup. I don't think there was that language back then, but they were doing a startup. And I had been living on the GI Bill, and so needed to do some kind of work with a wife and child. So I did 2 real jobs, each of which I could tolerate for about a month. I worked as a veterans benefits counselor for the VA in Boston. I can tell you my resistance story there, but I won't bother. Then I sold myself as a proofreader to the American Astronomical Society or something like that. I had no idea how to proofread or what those diacritical marks were or what have you, but I just sort of talked my way into it. But I could only tolerate either of those jobs for a little while. But when my wife and I'm not sure if we divorced yet, but separated, I didn't want to be in Boston anymore. So I spent all of 1 year, and I forget what year it was exactly, traveling around Europe. That's all that bouncing. But it was not bouncing. It was a year exploring. I spent a month or 6 weeks in Iceland, a couple of months in England, a couple of months in Hungary, different places for different reasons. Many months in Ireland. I liked Ireland. And then when I came back, I just came back to New York because that was home base. And that's where I was until I came out to San Francisco and then started sort of, I guess I would call it kind of a straight line journey in the Bay Area. I've been in the Bay Area from whatever it is now, the age of 27 to 75, whatever that is, coming on 50 years probably in the Bay Area.
So you're in your mid-20s, you have a
Oh,
wife. Yeah, go
sorry.
ahead.
There's something I should say about this bit of the story, and that is I had a pal who gave me books to write throughout this. I had a life as a ghostwriter during this time, and that's one of the ways I could live. You could give me any subject. You could name a subject. Making meals in your blender, and I could write you a book in a month on that subject. I'd make things up out of whole cloth. I did all kinds of books. I did a book on biorhythms and a book on best dating bars in America or something, which I did by writing to chambers of commerce and asking them, what are your best bars? So that's part of how I was already writing. What I forgot to mention was that about the age of 24, I started my first novel. And so my writing life started about at the age of 24. I was writing fiction from about the age of 24 on, and ghostwriting all kinds of books from the age of 24 on. So that's how I was living through my mid to late 20s, was by ghostwriting books.
Got it. And as far as like a career mindset, did you have one at all at that point? Or that you obviously you were an aspiring novelist, you were starting to write what would, I mean, I can only imagine if we went back in time and told your 24-year-old self that you would have 50 books, more than 50 books to your credit. I wonder what he would have made of that. But was writing a serious ambition?
I would have predicted that made sense to me. I would have predicted that I would have 50 books.
Wow.
But I would have predicted they would have been novels.
Right. So you were obviously very serious about that pursuit. The ghostwriting is how you were able to support your novel writing habit, right?
I was very serious about it, but you have to remember how tedious a manuscript creation was back then. You used carbon paper and whiteout. And so it took 19 times longer to produce a novel, just literally, just physically, than it does now. When you wanted to make a change, you had to retype the page. I don't know how many, my old Smith Corona, I don't know how many times I had to retype a whole manuscript. So that slowed me down.
It might have been, had you had modern technology, you might be on books number 80 by now.
That's exactly right. And by the way, although I've had 50 books published, I've written far more than that, because like every creative person, I have things that haven't worked. I have things in drawers that nobody's wanted. I've probably done 60 or 65 books. And I think that's good for people to know or hear.
Thank you for sharing that. Seriously, thank you for sharing that, because, you know, when we only know about any, you know, writer or artists, we only know about their finished products. And to us on the outside looking in, it can seem like this person is like superhuman, right? Like they only, you know, we don't get to see their messes.
Absolutely. Or their progression and how dull their first work might be. Like Dostoevsky, very conventional first novel, Poor Folk. Or Van Gogh's first drawings of potato eaters, very conventional. So it may not be failed stuff. It may just be not particularly creative stuff yet, or not particularly embodied stuff yet, not the real rich stuff yet. That's where people typically start, is, you know, not with their best stuff.
Yeah, and the trick is to persevere through all of that, right? To persevere through that and to keep working until you can tap into your voice and your originality, maybe.
Yeah, and to be, it's a word I use a lot, but just to be honorable about one's relationship to the work. Just to give you an example of what I mean by that, the fellow who wrote, I think it's called Memoir of a Geisha or Life of a Geisha, Memoir of a Geisha, perhaps.
Memoirs of a Geisha, yeah.
Yeah, that fellow. So the subject matter obviously interests him, so he writes a book, he writes a novel, but he writes it first in the third person. The geisha does this, the geisha does that, the geisha does this, the geisha does that. Takes him 2 years to write it. He reads it. Dead as a doornail. No life to it. an awful lot of writers are going to bash themselves. They're going to say, well, where did I get the idea to write this book? This is ridiculous, absurd. Plus, I have no talent. Plus, what am I doing? Plus, etc. That's what most writers will do. The honorable approach is to stay put and see the process through, and which is what he does. And so he says to himself, gee, what if I write it in the first person? With, of course, no guarantee that that's going to work. There's no store you can go to get that guarantee. So now he spends another 2 years, and I haven't read it, but apparently it works. Now he's done something that works. So that's what I mean about being an honorable relationship to one's own work. That sort of thing.
From your life story thus far, I'm hearing, I sense, maybe it's just my interpretation, but I sense kind of like a conflict maybe, or two dimensions to your attitude. Like there's a certain defiant attitude, like screw the rules, screw doing things. Like I don't care about school. I don't care about like the conventional way of doing things. But clearly somewhere in there, it was a very serious minded writer and, or perhaps something else. Are you being cavalier when you like sort of describe the sort of carefree side, or how serious do you think you were or weren't in your 20s?
Carefree. I mean, a resistance fighter is a serious person. So no, I'm not sure it's a conflict, or really, I'm not sure it's a different. I'm not sure there's a difference there. To me, they hang together. Now, sometimes it may be on the sarcastic side, or the sardonic side, or the ironic side, but those three things are not opposed to seriousness. They're just sort of a thumbing your nose seriousness as opposed to a serious seriousness.
Yeah.
But no, I don't see them as in opposition really at all. I've said this a lot. I've said this a lot. I'll just use it again here, just mention it again. I always have been taken by those days before D-Day when Eisenhower had to make his decisions about whether or not to launch D-Day on a given day, but also especially things like where to drop the paratroopers, given that if you drop them deeper into Germany, they'll do a better job for you, but you'll lose more of them. Making these decisions that are going to cost 20,000 lives here and 30,000 lives there, that's your job, is to make those decisions about whether to kill 20,000 folks there or 30,000 folks there. And that's always been to me the epitome of seriousness. And most people don't hold their lives as folks who need to be launching or organizing or launching a D-Day invasion. But I kind of invite people to think that that's the way they should be looking at their lives. Take their life that seriously, as if they had a D-Day invasion coming and it was all on their shoulders.
Why do you think most people don't?
Well, the short answer is these kinds of actions have consequences. That's the short answer. Most people want to go along to get along because it's safer. It's safety issues. I think it's quite simple, just safety issues.
Yeah, it's, you in your work you affirm people. You suggest that people affirm for themselves that they matter. There's no objective evidence to suggest that any of us matter in any significant cosmic way. And so you are a big advocate of not just artists, but people in general, affirming themselves and taking their lives seriously and telling themselves that they matter, because that's how you're going to get the best out of yourself. And why not?
It's the only way you make yourself proud. We have forgotten that we have our own requirements of ourselves. We want to make ourselves proud. We don't want to live a frightened, wimpy, scared, diminished life. It's not something we want for ourselves. That's not to say we may not do it. We may do those things that we're not wanting to do for all kinds of reasons, what Freud called secondary gain reasons. things that we don't even understand, reasons we don't even understand exist in the equation, but it's not making us happy. The only thing and by the way, happiness is not the goal. I think making ourselves proud by our efforts is in fact the goal. That's what we're after in life, to make ourselves proud.
I love that. And I think a lot of us probably have the sense that, oh, if we make other people proud, then we'll feel proud. But at some point, a lot of us discover that those two do not necessarily equate. Maybe they happily overlap in some instances, but they're not one and the same.
That's right. And if you grow up in most cultures, they don't overlap because most cultures are reactionary, conservative with a small c, rule bound, secret bound, hide bound. And if you're going to please those people, you're not going to be living a life of individuality or authenticity.
Yeah. You moved to California. What prompted the move?
Probably the California dream, but most straightforwardly, that my mom was living in San Francisco, my brother was living in Berkeley, and my sister was living in LA. The whole family had migrated. So I migrated out that way. I think that's really kind of the short answer. And then
And
I started a master's in creative writing at San Francisco State University in one of those years. I think it was 27, 28, 29, I'm not exactly sure. Then I met my current wife, and 2 days before her 30th birthday, I guess I was already 30. So we've been together 45 years. I guess that's the math. We've been together 45 years.
how did
And
you meet?
at a coffee shop, the Owl and the Monkey Cafe. Somebody introduced us. Many folks have been telling each of us that we were supposed to meet each other, and then someone finally
Huh.
introduced us. She was teaching high school English at a private high school. And because she liked her job, that gave me years and years and years of opportunity to do my own work without it having to make money. I can't tell you what a blessing that is to be allowed to just do your own thing year in and year out because your mate is happy doing what she's doing and bringing in a salary. It's kind of unheard of that there were
Hmm.
no kind of authority issues or dependency issues or shadows or any of that. It was very straightforward. She liked doing what she was doing. I liked doing what I was doing. Then the kids came along and I was the house parent. I was the house dad for the kids, two daughters, and I loved that. So it was really a perfect division of labor because I loved going to the playgrounds with them, and we lived right next door to San Francisco State, and we'd go onto the campus every day. I'd push them around in the stroller with a bottle of milk in my back pocket, and just push them around and have good days. And my mom would come out to babysit for portions of the day, which allowed me to do my writing. And at a certain point, and I'd be hard pressed to know exactly what point, it's probably 34, 35, thereabouts. I still had not been able to sell fiction. And so it seemed like an act of bad faith to continue writing fiction. So I decided to retool and become a therapist. I didn't know what that meant, as who does before you, before you encounter it, you don't know what it is. It's just one of those things that sounds sort of interesting. I'll be a therapist.
You had no
So,
experience of it in any way prior to
no,
that.
no. So I now had a master's in creative writing, but I completely retooled, and these were education years. So I got a second bachelor's in psychology from San Francisco State, and then a master's in counseling from San Francisco State. And then by that time I was interning at counseling centers in different places. And then I got my California marriage and family therapist license somewhere in those years. So by the age of about 40, let's say roughly, I was starting to write nonfiction and practicing as a therapist and working exclusively with creative and performing artists because I had sort of instantly decided or noticed that was a niche. This is before The Artist's Way. This is before any of my books. This is a long time ago, before artist issues were actually being addressed by anybody. Just as a segue, the only person of that older generation of psychology, the Freud and Jung generation, and Adler, that generation, the only person who taken interest in artists was Otto Rank, who did some interesting writing on artists and coined the phrase artist manqué, which he used to stand for the artist who flees the experience of freedom. Sort of what probably Julia Cameron is calling a shadow artist, somebody who could be an artist if he or she could be an artist. But that's all by way of saying I was on a particular journey now by about age 40 of being a therapist and writing nonfiction in the area of the challenges of creative performing artists. And my first book in that area, Staying Sane in the Arts, which came out from Tarcher. I'm not sure when that came out exactly, but that's part and parcel of this period of that journey.
All right. Now there's some stuff to unpack here. That's a staggering amount of school to endure, especially for someone that, is a bit of a resistance fighter, isn't it?
Yes, fortunately, many of the classes were pretty good. There was a fellow, I'll honor him now, Einhorn was his name, can't remember his first name, but I took a theories of personality class with him and an abnormal psychology class with him, and he was smart. He was the opposite of stupid. He was smart. And he would pause for effect. Students are incurious. Most students have no curiosity. So I had his undivided attention because I'd be the only one asking questions in his class. Like he would describe schizophrenia and he'd stop. He was just waiting for somebody to say, "What the hell are you talking about? This makes no sense." And he'd just sort of smile and wait there, and I'd raise my hand and say, "This makes no sense. Can you say how something can be diagnosed on the basis of a symptom picture rather than a cause? Tell me a little bit more about this." So in a way, I was having conversations rather than classes. So I didn't need to rebel because this was smart stuff.
Oh, fascinating, because, we're talking about curiosity versus learning and education. And this is a subject that is really fascinating to me because I've always considered myself highly curious, very interested in learning, but unless, like you described in your case, unless there's a teacher that I really respect and or a subject that really intrigues me, I kind of always felt like it was just a burden and I couldn't be bothered and, do the least amount of work I need to do to get through it.
Exactly right.
But the actual genuine curiosity is like a hunger for learning, whether it's in a formal context or not.
Right.
And I find that school it's this irony, like school ideally wants to encourage that curiosity and get people interested in, say, reading, but it often works against itself by making it mandatory. You must have 150 pages read by Friday. It's like, I don't want to do that.
Sure.
So I think that's a hard thing to reconcile, but it's impressive that after all the school, you had already had a master's in creative writing. You started from scratch and went this new route, get all the way from bachelor's through PhD. You had to do a dissertation for your PhD, right?
No, I went to I did the PhD remotely with a freestanding university, and all I had to do was submit. I'm not sure what I think they used the British model of tutors, but I had to submit papers which accumulated into enoughness. So it was really a series of papers, which ultimately I think became chapters in Staying Sane in the Arts. Again,
cool.
To say this simply, I could devise the program. And so I devised it in a way in which I did not have to jump through those terrible hoops that poor PhD students typically have to jump through. I did not have to.
And how many people actually get to use their dissertation in any other context ever again? Here, they produced actual chapters in a book that got published.
Yep. And I think, I can't remember back that clearly, but I think I had the strategic idea right from the get-go that I should be writing papers, even though they were supposedly on different subjects. I should figure out how to make them all connect so that they could go into the same book.
Right. At what point did you become, so you got your certification, you're a marriage family therapist, state of
Like
California,
not certification, license. It's just one of those things.
license.
Technically, we have to say it right.
Yeah, no, but thank you for that correction. But clearly, at some point, I'm guessing earlier on rather than later, you got disillusioned with the therapy model. How exactly did that happen, and how did you transition from that into the field of coaching? That's a big question, but
It is a
I'll let
big
you.
question. The short answers are I saw through it quickly. I mean, I'd seen through it all along that the mental disorder model, that the diagnose and treat model was illegitimate. I knew that from the get-go. I could tell. Just it was intellectually
Hmm.
clear that you can't call hating your boss a medical condition. It just makes no sense to call hating your boss or being in a bad relationship a medical condition, a pseudo medical condition where pills are the answer. It made no sense to me. Still doesn't, and it doesn't make sense. And it's a bad thing. But I saw through it quickly. Most therapists have to diagnose in order to be reimbursed by insurance. The client's insurance will only pay if you claim that the person has suffered from XYZ. So very soon on, I would say within, I wouldn't say months,
Hmm.
maybe it was a year or so of actual practicing out in the world. I've been doing a lot of seeing clients as an intern or an associate before I was fully licensed. So I had years of seeing clients as a therapist. I forget what the exact phrase was.
Number.
Maybe it is intern. I can't quite remember, but it was a pre-licensed person. So I had years of seeing clients as a pre-licensed person before I was licensed. And then it probably was no more than a year or two of being licensed when I decided to move from the therapy model to what I called creativity consulting. Coaching didn't quite exist yet. This is a long time ago. And there was really no word like coaching yet. So I called myself a creativity consultant. I started doing talks at places like, what were they called? Creativity and Madness conferences that a psychiatrist by the name of Barry Panther was running around the country. So
That sounds like fun. Creativity and madness.
It was fun. I did talks in Aspen and Santa Fe and other places. And then when coaching became a word, I'm sort of condensing here because for a while I was a creativity consultant. And then when coaching became a word, I embraced that phrase. I may have created that phrase, creativity coaching. And that's what I've been doing all these decades since.
Were you at all, it doesn't sound like it from the way you talk about it, but if I had gone through what you just described of all of that school, all of those degrees, and then all of those hours you have to put in, and then finally getting licensed and realizing you don't believe in this whole thing that you're doing, or at least the way that it's structured.
Yep.
Was that demoralizing, or did you simply just say,
No,
I'm going to pivot because this isn't for me?
no, it was just energizing. It's just the same resistance fighting. It's the same. Okay, that's humbug. I didn't realize that I would do so many books exposing that humbug over time, but I guess I kind of knew in some place in my being that I would. That I wasn't really leaving it behind in one sense because it still needed to be critiqued and deconstructed. So I left it off to the side to be dealt with later. But no, it was not demoralizing at all. I think one feels good seeing through things as long as you have the next step to take.
Hmm.
If you don't have a reasonable next step to take, that's something else. If you left it an abyss, that's something else. But I had a very reasonable next step to take, which was to have fun working with creative performing artist clients.
At any point along the way in your career and or just writing life, did you ever experience what you would consider something that was hugely disappointing or demoralizing, or were you always able to rally yourself to the next right thing, as it were?
Well, that's two different questions. I was always able to rally myself. The answer to that is I was always able to rally myself. Sure, lots of experiences have been disappointing in the publishing world. Every single one of my books deserves to be read by more people.
Mm.
So
I personally have to agree with that.
all of that is, disappointing, demoralizing, whatever the words are. And some blows are harsher or more difficult to take than other blows. I don't think I want to dredge up a litany of what they are, but the short answer is sure. There have been a ton of disappointments. My kind of way of being or mantra is to get over them sooner rather than later. Just get over them.
I love that. I love that phrase.
Um, but mostly because I had the next thing to do. Again, if I didn't have the next, if I had only one book to write and I'd written it and no one wanted it, then one would be quite stuck in that situation of having written one's one book. But I've never been in that place of not believing that the next thing wasn't coming. So
Is that self-confidence? Is that faith? What is that? Because, I imagine that people have different experiences with that. Some people feel like, oh, well, I have plenty of books in me. I'll just move on to the next one versus
I
someone
think
who's like, I have no idea what I'll write next.
I'm not sure it's any of those words exactly, self-confidence. It's a statistical reality. It's like, is it likely the sun will come up tomorrow? It's likely. One day it won't. It's likely that tomorrow it will. And just in my experience, it was likely that a next book was coming. I trusted that process. I didn't know what the book was till it came. I don't know what exactly dawn will look like. I think I'll let go of the analogy, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. It
I
sounds like a wonderful lack of control freakishness on your part, because I think a lot of people, right, they feel a need to, delude themselves that they're in control. And if you're not attached to something like being a specific way, then you're much more, I think, easily able to,
no, and I also
trust the process.
I also am completely aware that the next book may not be may not be the best or even a good iteration of the subject matter. I've been writing about meaning for a long time, and I've only been saying it well in the last X number of years. In the beginning, I had one of these classic failure books with Tarcher, probably in about 1995, 1996. I had done Staying Sane in the Arts, Fearless Creating, Affirmations for Artists, Deep Writing. I'd done a number of books with Tarcher, and they'd been successful. And Jeremy, a real person, Jeremy Tarcher, gave me carte blanche to do a book on anything I wanted to do. So I decided to do a book on meaning, except I didn't know what the heck I was talking about. So I wrote a book. By the way, you'll get this homage. I called it Lighting the Way.
Lighting the Way. I heard you mention this in another talk.
Yeah, in let's say 1995, 1996. And I wrote one goofy chapter after another. I went in this direction, I went in that direction. Jeremy and his executive editor, whose name I forget at this moment, both would write me little notes saying, "How's the book going?" And I would lie and say, "Wonderful. It's going to be a great book. Doing so well." Finally, I turned it in, and the poor executive editor had to write me and say, "There's nothing here we can use. What were you thinking?" So it was never published, of course. I got to keep the advance, which is one of those nice things about advances. If you honorably turn in a manuscript, you get to keep the advance. But so that's just an example of I didn't know what I needed to say yet. I didn't know how to talk about the paradigm shift from seeking meaning to making meaning. All the stuff that rolls off my tongue now, I had no idea how to say.
How did you get there from there to here?
It's called process.
Process.
That's the process. Just staying with it, refining ideas, getting what Virginia Woolf called an echo from the universe, getting feedback, hearing what people have to say. I've been doing this a long time.
I want to be respectful of your time, so I have a couple more questions I'd like to ask. This is maybe an unfair question because you've written books that deal with, you've written literally books on this subject, but it's a question I love asking people in general. I'm curious to see how you'll answer it. In your opinion, what do you think is the single most difficult aspect of the whole human being gig, this being alive as a human? What if you could point to, if you could sum it up succinctly, what do you think is the most difficult aspect of what, not just for creative people necessarily, but the human predicament? What is the most difficult aspect of it?
You're giving me the opportunity to quote Sartre. Hell is other people. The most difficult thing is the way in which we're not an okay species, the way fascism keeps coming back. You may or may not remember the end of Camus' novel, The Plague, which ends roughly the following way, with Camus saying, the rats always return for the edification of mankind. The rats have returned again, and they keep returning. The hardest thing is other people.
So as a follow-up to that, what gives you hope, or how do you contend with the large other people, capital O, capital L, capital P rather?
Oh, that's not a short answer question. Nothing gives me hope for the species. Nothing gives me hope for the species. I have hope for individuals and individual effort. I enjoy life. That's different from hope for the species. I don't think there's anything that gives me hope for the species, but there's plenty that gives me hope for individual effort and for individuals to realize their dreams. For the person who is stuck writing her novel to actually finish her novel and publish it, I have hope for those people, and I have hope for those experiences. I have hope for the ability for those things to happen, but that's different from hope for the species.
That answer really reminds me of what George Carlin said, essentially almost exactly the same thing. Okay, final question. How would you describe, you've had an incredible career, honestly. From my vantage point, I agree. I wish more people knew about your books. I wish more people were exposed to them and read them, because speaking personally, they've been really valuable to me and really helpful to me. What is as far as, this moment in your life, what are your aspirations now and moving forward? Who is the person you want to be moving forward, or what does that look like for you?
Well, it's a combination of more of the same with something new, but I don't know what the something new is. So that becomes more of the same while I'm waiting for something new. That's process. So for me, I have more books to write and more books to edit and more books to collaborate on, more webinars to give, more this, more that, more of the same. I would like there to be something else also, but I don't know what that is.
So you're open to it.
I am open to it.
Dr. Eric Maisel, thank you so much for this incredible conversation, for all of your inspiring work. Where can people go to learn more about you and to find all of your books and other offerings?
The website is ericmaisel.com, ERICMAISEL.com, and that's the place to go.
Thank you once again. Any final parting words for us?
No, thank you for having me.
All right. Excellent. Take good care.